education. Sir did MD in homeopathy from Dr. Bala Saheb Ambedkar Marathwada University, Aurangabad. Sir did his PG diploma in medical education from University of South Wales, United Kingdom. Sir did his BSc in teacher technology, that's very important, from Sikkim Manipal University, Gangtok. And sir is also MBA in education management from Alappa University, Karnataka. Sir is having a Srumani Award in 2017, honored with the Best Teacher Award by the Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Science, Karnataka, in the category of homeopathy subject. In 2019, Sir received the Kamalaben Babia Memorial Award of Outstanding Contribution to by that Associations of Teachers of India, that we known as APTI. And Sir also received the Professor Vadgaonkar Memorial Best Teacher Award for homeopathic subject, and especially by the Homeopathic Medical Association of India. Sir is also a chairman of Board of Studies of Homeopathy in PG as well as UG at Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Science, Bangalore. Sir has also worked as an assistant registrar in the same university, Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Science, Karnataka, and worked as a registrar at Karnataka Board of Homeopathic System of Medicine, Bangalore. Sir has published 7 publications and 11 books to his credit. And as I said, Sir is very versatile and a dynamic professor. And I welcome you, sir. And now over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Vimal Kumar. Shall I start?
Yes, sir. Yeah, you can start, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Vimal Kumar. And can I request the host to enable me to share the screen?
Yeah, Dr. Sukhbant, give the right to co-host.
Allowed, sir. Allowed.
Yeah. Now you can say, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Vimal Kumar, for this wonderful introduction. And I also thank the SRITS group of institutions, Dr. Munir and Dr. all the faculty from the university for having invited me. And also welcome all the honorable teachers who are attending this. I understand that there's a cross-section of faculty who are attending here. You have teachers from pharmacy, from engineering, from veterinary, humanities, various courses who are attending this program. Anyway, the program that I am going to present is not something which is very specific to any faculty. It can be generalized as a kind of a generic platform which any teacher can find useful, especially in the higher education faculty, in the higher education scene. I bring greetings from Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences, which is celebrating the 25th year of its founding this year. When we have a program like this, most of the time there is a kind of anxiety, there's a kind of disbelief that I'm a teacher, all right, why do I need any training in how to be a teacher? There's a kind of feeling many teachers have, and this is more acute, specifically when we come to health sciences faculty. Because in any health science faculty, except perhaps in the nursing faculty, there is nothing like a formal training for the teachers in education methodology. Nursing faculty has a subject called health education, but sometimes it becomes only a subject. Like people learn it, people write the exam and they pass. Whether they can practice it is another matter. So when we have a program like this, most of the time there's a kind of disbelief that there should be a program of training the teachers, because we all have been teachers for so long, that what is there for me to learn to be a teacher? And sometimes even the younger generation of students, teachers, they feel, see, my teachers have been teaching for so long without any formal qualification. Why do I need this? In fact, it is these kind of myths that I'm going to dispel through this session to some extent. And this session is a kind of presentation on sensitizing education methodology for teachers of professional education. It could be any professional education. The purpose of this session is to orient the teachers in professional education domain and the principles of educational methodology as relevant to university level education. After completing this session, you will be in a position to justify the need for training teachers in professional education for academic excellence. This is the takeaway message that the teachers would take from this session. At the end of this session, you will be specifically in a position to discuss what are the components of curriculum, illustrate the basic teaching model, relate the role of constructive alignment for teaching and assessment, recall the factors that promote learning outcomes, match assessment tools to measure learning outcomes, and plan a professional development track in education methodology. These are the objectives I have set for this session. And if you look at these objectives, whatever statements I have written, you can see that there are two things which are common to each of these 6 statements. One common feature is that each of the statement tells what you as a participant will be able to do. It doesn't tell what I am going to do. Whatever I am going to do is incidental to that. Second thing is, if you again closely look at these statements, each of the statements starts with a verb and it is an active verb. The importance of this verb and active verb, I'll come to a little later in the session. So these are the objectives which we will revisit at the end of the session to check whether we are able to perform these objectives or these statements at the end of this session. So what has been the outcome of this session presentation? When you look at this image, it looks very commonplace that there is a tap and there's a glass and some water is getting filled here. But can you find an analogy for this tap and water with the glass to education? If you think a little more, what you can see here, if you can relate it, what you can see here is that the glass is the student, the tap is the teacher or the institution, and the water that is flowing down is the knowledge or the skill. So here the model is, we have a tap or the teacher or the university is there which has a lot of knowledge or water, and whenever we want, we will open the tap and the glass will be filled, and whenever we close, we'll see that the glass is filled. When the glass is filled, we will close it. So whenever we want to drink water, we'll drink from that glass. So this is a model that most of us have in education now. So that glass is a student, but the students are not a glass. Students are not inanimate like glass. Students are human beings, and they also have their anxieties and aspirations about learning, the need for learning. Therefore, we cannot be treating the students like a glass which is inanimate and simply pour water into them or pour the knowledge or skill into them. This doesn't work, especially in the present or the future age. So therefore, we need to, before we go for teaching, we need to understand who our customers are, who our stakeholders are, how our students learn. So in this background, I'll present 2 simple theories about learners. There are about 71 theories which explain how the learners learn, different styles and approaches of learning. But I'm only going to take about 2 approaches. One is called as, before that, learner is focus of our educational activity. This is the slogan that all teachers have to maintain, that learner is a focus of our educational activity. Therefore, whatever educational activity that we conduct, we have to always keep the student at the center of our planning and our execution. There are, as I told you, there are about 70 or 71 types of theories of learning. One of the theory of learning is called as VARK theory, V-A-R-K. It is called visual, auditory, reading, and kinesthetic. So what it says is, our learners can be classified into these 4 categories. Learners can be either visual learner. That is, a learner will learn only when he or she is able to see something. So this is one kind of category of learners. So the visual learners. In fact, Einstein had a very famous quote, when he said that if I cannot imagine, I cannot learn. So Einstein was a kind of a visual learner. So there are visual learners, learners who learn when they see something. Then there are learners who are called as auditory learners, who can learn when they hear something. In fact, to cut a small joke here, if you see any student in your class who is closing the eyes and sitting, please do not think the student is sleeping. Perhaps he is auditory learner. Just a kind of in a lighter vein. So there are students who are auditory learners who learn better when they hear something. In fact, if you recall, maybe a student is, you could recall some of your classmates used to read the book loudly, even in the library. So these people had to be told not to make noise in the library. These are the people who might be auditory learners who can learn only when they hear something. The third category is those who read something. So reading need not be only about hearing. It is something where the student connects a kind of cognitive relevance for their learning. So the fourth category is a kind of students who can learn only when they do something. In fact, if you can even go back to your classes and think, there could be some student whom we had branded as somebody who is a dull student, who is non-responsive in the classroom, because that student was not answering any questions in the class. But when you take the same student into a laboratory or into a community setting, you will be astonished to see the kind of work that student does. These are the kind of students who could be classified perhaps as kinesthetic students. Kinesthetic students would not learn only by seeing or hearing, they would learn only by doing. Therefore, the reason why we have to classify the students is to understand what is the learning style and how we can respond to their learning needs. Not to classify anybody as a slow learner or a dull learner or somebody who is no good. So these are some of the ways in which we can learn. We identify the learners. The reason why we have to identify the learner is the slogan, please remember, learner is a focus of all educational activity. So whatever activity the teacher does has to be relevant for the learner's learning needs. Therefore, one of the ways of making the learner as a focus of educational activity is by understanding who our learners are and how do they learn. The second is because we are into a situation where most of our students are adults or adolescents. There's a theory called as adult learning theory or andragogy, and it becomes very important for us to understand the students are adolescents and their learning needs and their learning style is somewhat different from the way children learn. For this, there is a theory called andragogy or adult learning theory, which Malcolm Knowles he propagated around the 1960s. What it says is all adult learners come with experience. If you look at any of your students, whoever has come to the university education, whether it is in the pharmacy field, veterinary field, or whichever field, each of the student who has joined your course has come with a 10+2 qualification. And in the 10+2 qualification, perhaps somebody who has come to pharmacy faculty would have learned chemistry in the 10+2. So when the teacher is speaking something about pharmacy, chemistry, they would relate to their previous learning. So the adult student already has some experience about whatever we are going to speak about. So the importance of this is you have to build on this experience. Building on this experience, one more dimension to that is when you build on the experience of a learner, you are also showing that you respect that person's learning. The person already has something. You are not saying whatever you have learned is useless. You start learning of everything fresh from now. It is not like that. The student already has some experience and we build on that experience. This is very important. This is one of the adult learning feature. The second feature is that every adult has a self-concept. In that view, go back to the previous slide of work classification. Each of the student has an identity that I am a visual learner or I am a auditory learner. So they have this kind of identity and they have this self-concept. The students themselves know about how they learn. The third is students will be willing to learn when they are ready to learn. In fact, this readiness to learn is something which can come from various factors. But one of the factors that you also have experienced is when students are ready to learn, we think, okay, maybe exams are nearby. So when the exams are announced, students become ready to learn. So there is a kind of motivation or a factor for anybody to learn that is called as readiness to learn. And this readiness to learn is something which is very pronounced in adult learners. The next one is called motivation to learn. All adults learn when they are motivated to learn. Now, how do we bring about this motivation? Before we go to that, motivation could be either intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is where the students are innately interested to learn, whereas the extrinsic motivation is where there is a kind of outside pressure, a social pressure. Because of that, the students are willing to learn, are motivated to learn. This external pressure could be because of the examination. It could be because of the peer pressure, where they see that the other students are also learning. If I don't learn, I get branded. So they learn because of the external pressure. It is not that they want to learn on their own. So when do they prefer to learn on their own is when they see some authenticity for their learning. when they see that whatever I'm learning is relevant for my professional practice, for my future professional need, this learning is important. That is what brings about the intrinsic motivation. And the intrinsic motivation is very necessary for continuing learning, which is called as lifelong learning. So motivation to learn is one more feature of adult learning. And the fifth one is very important. It is called orientation to learn. So when you say orientation to learn, how do we learn? So if you look at our education system has something which is like compartmentalized boxes. If you take any course, there are, say for example, if you take a health science course, in the health science course, there is a subject called anatomy, there is a subject called physiology, there is biochemistry, there is pathology. There are different courses which are learned separately. But when the student performs as a professional, say for example, student performs as a pharmacy professional or a veterinary professional, the student is performing as a professional, and for the whole person, like it could be the whole person, not that the student is looking at the anatomy of a person or a physiology of a person. So therefore, the practice is something which is holistic for the whole thing, but our learning is something which is into different compartments. This is where some kind of a dissonance sets into the learning. If you see students are not learning, some of the students are not learning properly, they are not motivated to learn. One of the reasons is that their orientation is towards the whole, to an issue, to a problem, but what we are teaching is something like a subject. So there is a disconnect in our learning. What we have to do is we have to bring about some kind of an improvement in this orientation to learn. And if you look back, these are the way even we would like to learn, because as an adult, this is how you would like to be respected for whatever you know. You have a self-concept, and you are ready to learn only when you are interested for it, and when you feel that there is a kind of relevance for that learning. So these are some of the factors that you'll have to include into your understanding as a teacher, so that you understand your students. Now moving further, if you have to define education, I have taken a definition from WHO definition from J.J. Gilbert. J.J. Gilbert's definition of education, written in his book, Handbook for Health Professionals, published by WHO. What it says is education is a continuous process. Here what you have to be focused on is that education is something which is two things. One is it is a process, it is not a product. Second thing is it is something which is continuous. It is not something which is off and on, like it stops somewhere and then continues. It's not like that. It is something which is a continuous process. It continues forever. That is why you call learning is something which is lifelong. So it's a continuous process. What is the purpose of this? The purpose of this is that it has a chief goal. Education has a chief goal, has a purpose. Now, what is this purpose? The purpose of education is to bring about desirable changes. Desirable changes in the behavior of learners on a relatively permanent basis. So this is a kind of gist of what education is. So education, if I can summarize still here, education is a continuous process which intends to bring about some changes, and these changes have to be desirable changes. Who decides these desirable changes is a different matter. It is something like you decide what is desirable, say for a pharmacy course or for a veterinary course, depending on what is the community health needs, what is the strength of that discipline, and what are the task analysis of that particular course or that profession. So depending on this, what are the changes that are required to be brought about in a student who has started to learn a particular course is what is education. So when there is a change, if a student is at point A, from point A to point B, if the student is shifting, if there is a shift to point B, there is a change. If there is no shift, the student is stuck at point A, that means there is no education. So education is something which is to bring about a desirable change in the behavior of learners on a relatively permanent basis. And how do we bring about this change? This change is brought about by way of acquiring knowledge. When the students acquire knowledge, there is a change in the behavior. Say, for example, if the student, you can imagine any of your classes where the student did not know about a particular terminology. So the behavior of that student to that particular terminology was something different. And when the student learn what is the meaning of the terminology, the behavior itself changes. So the behavior has changed because of acquiring knowledge. Similarly, the behavior change can also happen by improving the skill and by developing the attitude. So this developing of attitude is something which is very, very important, because unless there is an attitudinal change, nothing will happen. There is no change which can happen in anybody's behavior unless that attitude changes. Therefore, learning is something which has to be brought about by a very systematic way of bringing a desirable change in the behavior of learners by way of knowledge, skills, and attitude. I would say that this is a very comprehensive definition of education, because whatever you want to understand about education is existing within this definition. And if you want to find any answer anywhere in any education system, you can come back to this definition. If it doesn't give if it doesn't give the complete solution, at least it will tell you where to find that solution. So it is so much comprehensive. Before we go further, I would like you to remember the last 3 lines in this definition. That is acquiring of knowledge, improving skill, and developing attitude, because we will be coming back to these 3 lines a little later. So therefore, please remember these 3 lines. Now, when we say education, the education or curriculum, it has 3 components. When you deliver curriculum, the curriculum, again, drawing from the definition of education, education said there is a purpose. Education is based on a goal. Now, how do you state the goal? Goals are stated in any course in the form of learning objectives. These learning objectives could be at different levels. It could be a course level, it could be a department level, subject level, or a specific learning level. So these are the objectives. Objectives are nothing but the goals that you expect the students to perform, or the outcomes you expect to see in the students at the end of learning. If you again go back to the first or second slide of this session, I had stated 6 statements. Those are the learning objectives of this session. So these are learning objectives. The second component of education would be, how do you make the students learn these learning objectives or perform these learning objectives? That naturally comes by way of some teaching learning methods and media. Now, the teaching learning methods and media, if you look at this diagram, you can see there is an arrow which is pointing to both the sides of learning objectives and teaching learning methods and media. What it means is that the learning objectives and the teaching learning methods and media, these are interconnected. The way we select our teaching method would depend on the kind of learning objective that is there. For example, if you want a student to recall some historical fact, what you would do is give a lecture to the student. So that would be appropriate for the student to learn what are the historical dates of some event. Suppose you want the student to paint a diagram or to draw a diagram. If I give a lecture on how to draw a diagram, would it be useful? It doesn't, because that is not appropriate for it. So to make the student learn how to draw a diagram, we'll have to demonstrate how to draw a diagram and help the student to go about those motions of drawing the diagram. Now you can see here the objective or the purpose is deciding which is the most appropriate teaching learning method. Similarly, if you want to check whether the student is able to perform the objective that you had set, what is the outcome, that is by the assessment method. That assessment method also is dependent on the nature of learning objective. Like in taking the same 2 examples, if you want to check whether the student is able to list the historical facts, you can ask a question in the theory or in the viva. What are those historical facts? When the student answers it, you are sure that the student knows the answer, he has the knowledge. And on the other hand, if you want to know whether the student is able to draw a diagram, and if I ask the student, explain how will you draw a diagram, the student may explain. But how am I sure that the student is able to draw that? So the best would be to ask the student to draw the diagram. So here also you can see the assessment method is dependent on the nature of the objective. So similarly, the other 2 components are also related. When you look at the assessment, the success of the assessment will tell how successful the teaching method was, and the way we have taught will decide how authentic the assessment would be. So this is called as a curriculum spiral. These are the 3 components of education or 3 components of curriculum. Now, before I go further, I would like to clarify 2 terms here. One is curriculum, the other is syllabus, because this is where a lot of misunderstanding is there. When you look at the word curriculum, the curriculum is a kind of document, like for example, any country would have a constitution. That constitution tells how that country would be running. So what are how are the laws to be made? Who holds what position? All these are explained in the constitution. Similarly, if you look at a curriculum is like the constitution for a course. For example, the curriculum tells who is eligible to get admission into a particular course, or who is eligible to teach a particular course, what are the subjects to be taught, what are the different phases of teaching, how the assessment has to be done. All these factors are explained in the curriculum. So curriculum is like a regulatory book for any course. Now what is syllabus? Syllabus is a list of topics which have to be taught in a particular subject. For example, if I have a subject called chemistry in the first year, so what are the topics to be taught for chemistry in the first year? This it is syllabus. For example, no, chemistry is also taught in second year. What is the syllabus for chemistry in second year? That becomes syllabus. You teach chemistry in the first year for this, in the second year for this. That is what the curriculum says, and the details of what you are going to teach, how you are going to teach, all these come under syllabus. So syllabus is a part of curriculum. This is one kind of a simple classification that you can have. Now, to continue the same three components of education, there is one more concept called constructive alignment, which Biggs has developed. It is called constructive and alignment. Alignment is having all the components together. Constructive is again in the context of an adult learner, because all adult learners are said to be learning in a kind of constructivist psychology. What constructivist psychology says is that when we learn something like an adult learner, I see something, but I don't agree with the whole thing. I do not take it the way it is presented to me. When somebody gives a lecture, for example, when you are listening to me, you are not listening to me and taking whatever I am telling you. While you are listening, you are also trying to relate it to whatever you already know, and you make a kind of integration of what you know and what I am talking, and store it as your belief. So this is how all adults learn. So there is a kind of interplay between what the adult already knows and what the adult is receiving as a learning stimulus. Then there is a kind of interaction between these two. That is what the adult believes, and that is what the adult stores as learning. This is called construction. So what constructive psychology? So what Biggs said is that all adult learners need a kind of constructive alignment. If you are teaching to an adult learner, it is not only the alignment that you have to create, but also you have to create something called as constructive alignment. So how does this constructive alignment come about? Is the same principles that we discussed earlier in the three components of curriculum, but Biggs give it a little more refinement to state that the expected outcomes have to be totally aligned with the learning activity. For example, whatever learning activity that we are providing has to be appropriate for achieving that learning outcome. Second, the third one is, what he says is, the assessment methods have to be authentic to check the learning outcome. For example, if you have to check whether the student is able to draw a diagram, the authentic assessment would be to ask the student to demonstrate by drawing that particular diagram, not any other diagram, specifically that particular diagram. So this is where constructive alignment comes in. And these are the two you could say the principles which have to be the bedrock for every teacher to plan their teaching. So these are the two tools. One is the spiral of curriculum, the other is the constructive alignment. Now to move further from this constructive alignment and the three components of curriculum, if you look at our own practices as teacher, how do we teach? If you reflect, there's a kind of model, basic teaching model, which we all use for teaching. For example, when I have to teach, I start with an objective that this is a purpose. I expect my students to perform this particular objective at the end of this session. So I state the objective. The students are also aware of what this objective is. Then once I state the objective, there's a kind of misunderstanding right now among many teachers that I go for teaching. I do not teach directly after stating the objective. There is one more activity that I have to do before I start teaching. Now let me again take you back to your classrooms to make you realize what you actually do before you start teaching. Suppose this is you are continuing a class. Yesterday you had a class, today you have the continuity of that class. Before you start today's class, what do you naturally do? You ask a few questions about the previous class, right? You do not go directly and say that this is our objective, this is what we are going to learn, and start directly with today's topic. You will ask some questions about the previous day's topic and then build on that, whatever the students answer, build on that for today's topic. This is called as entry behavior assessment. Entry behavior assessment is, again, the word behavior comes from through the definition of education, behavior in the form of knowledge, skill, or attitude. At the beginning of the class, what is the behavior or the knowledge, skill, attitude the student already has? And this is where, again, we are bringing the adult learning principle of the previous experience. We are building on the previous experience. So when you build on the previous experience, the students feel respected, that the teacher is concerned about me. The teacher has a concern about me to check how much I know, and the teacher is building on that. So that kind of a care and concern the teacher exhibits. So this is called entry behavior assessment. After the entry behavior assessment, the teaching happens. After the teaching is done, there is assessment. This is called as a basic teaching model, which Glaser described in his book in 1962. Now, I am using this basic teaching model also as a formula to check how the students would be learning and how to improve the success of learning. So, for example, if a particular group of students or a batch of students are in a particular subject, some students are not performing well, their scores are not good, their examination performance is not that very laudable, then how do you identify what could be the problem why the students are not performing so well? If you use this as a formula, it gives a kind of indicator on where the problem is and how to solve the problem. Because when you know where the problem is, it becomes easier for you to solve the problem. So from the assessment, after conducting the assessment, you get a feedback to tell whether the teaching method was appropriate or not. Therefore, one of the problem could be that the teaching method was not appropriate. Why the students have not performed well is because the constructive alignment was not applied and the teaching method was not aligned to the expected outcomes. This could be one of the problems why the students have not performed well. The second possibility could be that the entry behavior assessment was not properly checked. We did not check what the student already knew or did not know, and then we have started bombarding the students, so nothing was received there. So one of the problem could be the entry behavior assessment was not properly assessed. The third possibility could be that the educational objective that we had set was not appropriate for this class or appropriate for this level, or the educational objectives were not clearly communicated to the students. Students did not know what they were expected to perform, therefore they failed in the examination. This is one more possibility. The fourth possibility is quite interesting. What it says is that the assessment method itself perhaps was not appropriate. So again, coming back to the constructive alignment, what is expected is the assessment method and the learning objectives have to be aligned. If there is a misalignment, there's a kind of disaster which could happen. So these are the four possibilities how the student might not have performed well and how we can improve the learner performance. This is also a formula. When you look at this heap of books, and suppose you want to pick a particular book, how easy it would be? Perhaps I would find it very difficult. How do I make it simpler or easier to pick the book? Perhaps by arranging like this. Now what happens in this is, the books are arranged and the books are aligned in a particular fashion. It becomes easier for me to select whichever book I want. So what has happened here basically is that there is a planning. When you say planning, very simply what planning is to decide before doing something. If we decide this is how I am going to do something, before you do that, it becomes planning, as simple as that. So it could be 1 minute before, it could be 1 hour before, it could be whatever, but before doing something, you are planning. So that is what is planning. Therefore, planning in education becomes very important. And how do we plan? The tool for planning education is something called as Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom's taxonomy is one of the tools which almost every teacher from the kindergarten to the university level teachers, they use. What it says is, in the entire learning content can be classified under 3 categories. One is called as cognitive category. Cognitive again called means knowledge. The words are called so because of the reason that Professor Benjamin Bloom was a psychologist and they use the psychological terminology there. So cognitive domain meaning to say the student has some knowledge, learns knowledge, learning happens in the knowledge domain, or it could happen in something like psychomotor domain. Psychomotor domain is something skill, psycho, mind, motor, some activity. So eye-hand coordination, eye eye leg coordination, whatever coordinations are there where movements happen, some physical activity is being done, is psychomotor domain. So psychomotor domain is the second component or the second way learning can happen. And the third is affective domain. Please note the spelling, it is affective, not affection. So it is affective domain. Affective domain is something which a person feels, a kind of value or a kind of attitude. If you look back, the three lines of the three sentences in the definition of education, the last three sentences, I told you I'll be coming back to that. So it said knowledge, skill, and attitude. What you can see here is knowledge, skill, and attitude. The entire education is classified into three areas, broad areas: knowledge, skill, and attitude. It's very important for every teacher to know that whatever I am teaching could fall either into knowledge, skill, or attitude to whatever extent. Sometimes when you look at some statement, we say this for to perform this student, to perform this statement, the student has to think about something, or the student has to do something, or the student has to feel some value for it. So this is how the entire learning can be classified into, and this is one of the tools for planning teaching. To give you an insight into how this can be classified, how this can be used, I'm going to give you some examples. One is we can classify again this purpose or the aim into aim and objective. Aim is something which is very broad. So for example, if I have to use in a health science course, measure the blood pressure of a patient. Now, to measure the blood pressure of a patient is something of a very broad activity. It is not something which is very specific. It is something which is very broad, and it has multiple activities within it. And when you look at measure the blood pressure of patient, it doesn't fit into any of the three domains. It is neither only cognitive or nor only psychomotor nor only affective domain. It would have almost all the components. That is what is the characteristic of aim. Aim, which is a broad statement. Now, to make it much smaller, much specific, what we have is objectives. And this example of objective could be something like list 3 causes for hypertension. That is, after learning, the student would be able to list 3 causes of hypertension. Or it could be something like the student will be able to wrap the cuff firmly around the arm of the patient. Or it could be something like the student will be able to relieve the anxiety of the patient before measuring blood pressure. These are the 3 objectives which are drawn from 3 different domains. For example, if the student has to list what are the causes of hypertension, he or she will have to think. So it comes under knowledge. If the student has to wrap the cuff around the arm of a patient, the student will have to do something. The student cannot think and perform this activity. The student will actually have to do something. So this is a psychomotor activity. And to relieve the anxiety of patient before measuring blood pressure, it is a kind of a value or an attitude the student must have. We can see doctors or students or medical students directly getting into the patient and wrapping the arm and measuring the blood pressure. That could be measuring blood pressure, but that is not the way to do it. There's a way of doing it. A person who has come for getting the blood pressure measurement is already anxious, and when a person does it without a kind of relieving the anxiety, naturally the blood pressure would be some notches above. So therefore, relieving the anxiety, telling the patient, this is the procedure I am going to do about. If you feel any pain, any discomfort, let me know, I will stop it. That will naturally bring about some kind of a decrease in the anxiety level of the patient, and whatever authentic measure you want to take of the patient, the student will be able to take. Therefore, this is a kind of attitude or a value or a communication. So any of these 3. But when you look at any of the objectives which have to be written, the objective will be either specifically in the knowledge domain, or in the psychomotor domain, or in the affective domain. When they are in multiple domains, they no longer belong to a single domain. They do not become objective. They go beyond objective into aim. So therefore, whenever you see a statement which is having multiple domains or more than one domain, it is not specific to a particular domain, or it is not an objective or a specific learning objective. That would be aim, at the level of aim. This is the distinction. Now I have some kind of interaction for the participants here, because I was told that there will be a mix of faculties. I have taken a mix of statements here, which would be appropriate for different people. Now, if there is a statement like perform basic configuration on routers, when the engineering student has to do that, electronic engineering specifically, if they have to do that, the student will have to do something. The student will not be able to perform this by thinking what is the basic configuration to perform. It has to be something which is called as psychomotor domain, where the student performs. Now you can see here, it is not something which only an engineering student or engineering teacher can understand. Anybody with little intelligence can understand that this is something which is in the psychomotor domain. So the education methodology is something which is a very neutral track where we can fit any of our subjects into. It is a kind of you have a kind of track where you have a road on which the car can go, the bus can go, the motorbike can go, whatever can go. It is like a route. It's like a road. Similarly, education methodology is also like a track where anybody can travel. So to perform basic configuration of on routers, the student will have to do something. So it becomes a psychomotor domain. The second one is diagnose cases of canine pyometra. Again, coming from a veterinary domain. If the student has to diagnose cases of canine pyometra, the student will have to think what is a possible diagnosis. Think and decide. So thinking and deciding is something which is a cognitive activity. Therefore, it will be cognitive domain. Yes. The third sample I have here is work actively as a member of healthcare team. I have used healthcare team. It could be any team. So when a student has to work actively as a member of healthcare team, it is not just the knowledge that this is how a healthcare team person works, or this is what the activity a healthcare person does, but it is a kind of value that I have to work as a team. Therefore, it is a kind of attitude a person has to develop, the student has to develop. Therefore, this would be into the affective domain. Next one would be calibrate the hot air oven as per the given SOP. If the student has to calibrate the hot air oven, the SOP is given, it is a performance which is expected. Therefore, it would be something like the psychomotor domain. The next one, identify errors of reasoning, could be from some of the humanities, logic or philosophy. If student has to identify errors of reasoning, what are the errors of reasoning? It is something where the student has to think what are the errors of reasoning. So this would be something like a cognitive domain. Avoid biases that influence judgment. Now, when somebody has to avoid a bias that might influence the judgment, it could be a clinical judgment, it could be a social judgment, it could be any of the judgment, a family judgment, it could be any of the thing. If you are biased about something, naturally our judgments go wrong. So therefore, to be consciously avoiding some bias is an attitude. Therefore, this would be in the affective domain. The next one, describe the history of human stratification. To describe something, the student will have to have the knowledge, acquire knowledge. Therefore, this would be in the cognitive domain. And the last one, explain the concepts of urbanization. To explain any concept, it is only a thinking. So therefore, it would also be in the cognitive domain. So these are some of the objectives which I have listed here for a kind of interaction. In fact, there could be multiple objectives which can be written here. The purpose of this session is to introduce to the participants that there is something like a specific learning objective, and we can identify the specific learning objectives given the tool of Bloom's taxonomy. When you have the tool of Bloom's taxonomy, using that tool, you can identify which is the which statement belongs to which domain. Now, further on, the teachers should be in a position to also write objectives like this for their own courses. That is what would be expected when you are planning for your lessons and for your teachings. Now, what is the purpose of these objectives? The purpose of objective is, like in the beginning, we said learner is the focus of all educational activity. If the learner has to be focus of educational activity, how do we teach? We teach by stating the objective. So the objective has to be student directed. Therefore, the purpose of objective is to make the course student directed. That is one purpose of the course or function of the objective. The second is the objective doesn't only tell what the student has to learn, it also tells how the student would learn. So this brings in the kind of quality dimension into learning. So this is not simply what, but also how. And the third is very important. Others are also important. The third is quite important. What it says is, just look at this traffic signal on the screen. One says keep left, the other shows move to the right. It is giving a kind of confused signals. Similarly, sometimes we also have confused signals in our teaching or in our assessment. So, for example, I have taught to the students in my particular course saying this is important and that is important according to me. And then when the students appear for the exam, they get a question paper, and in the question paper, whatever the person who thinks important for himself or herself, those questions will come. And his importance, my important may not be the same. So that is where we get the mixed signals. And the worst will happen when the paper goes for valuation. The person who is doing the valuation will have his own idea of what is important. So therefore, this creates a kind of muddle for the whole education system. Now, how do we avoid is to have a clarity into education system, something like where you have a clarity of the traffic signal. When the traffic signal says go to the left, nobody has an accident if they go to the left. If that is what, there is a clarity of communication. Similarly, what the objective does is it improves communication. When the objective is written and the objective is shared, the student knows what he or she has to learn, the teacher knows what he or she has to teach, and the person who is setting the question paper knows how the questions have to be set, and the person who is doing the valuation of the script knows what is the answer to be expected for that particular question. Now you can see that there is a kind of total clarity in the communication, and whenever there is a clarity in communication, there is a lack of fear. There is no fear. So the students will not have fear of examinations when there is a clarity of communication and the objectives are clearly stated, the outcomes, what is expected of the student are clearly stated. So this is what we have to aim at. Once we have stated these are the objectives, how do you identify, how do you make the students learn? There are some factors which can influence the way we select the teaching methods. One is the type of students. What is the nature of student? The student could be visual learner, auditory learner. We already have discussed those things. But what is a good thing for us is that 90% of our students are audio-visual learners. Therefore, audio-visual would be the most preferred. It is the most preferred medium of teaching for all the teachers. But we also have to remember that there could be some students who are not totally audio-visual. There could be kinesthetic also. Therefore, we have to identify some learning method for the students who are not totally audio-visual. So one is student type, which influences the way we select the teaching method. The second is the context for learning. Now the context for learning could be in the classroom, it could be in the community, it could be in the laboratory, it could be in the clinical hospital, it could be anywhere. Depending on the context where the learning has to happen, the appropriate teaching learning method will have to be selected. The other factor is the domain of learning. Depending on whether the learning is cognitive, affective, or psychomotor, depending on that, the appropriate learning method will have to be selected. And the fourth one is the size of the class. If the size of the class is large, perhaps I would go for a lecture. If the size of the class is small, so for example, there could be a large class, more than 50 students in a class. There could be something like a small group, something like 10 or 12 students, where I can have a group discussion. Or there could be something like a single student who is there. And for that single student, giving a lecture would be something which is not appreciable. Therefore, for a single student, it could be something like a library reference, or it could be something like a personalized practice. Personalized practice, if it is something like a skill that which the student has to do. So depending on the size of the class also, the teaching method can be selected. And finally, the teaching method can be selected whether who is in the control. Teacher is in control or learner is in control. For example, if it is, no, all these are interwoven. All these 5 overlap with one another. It's not that everything is something which is separate. Say, for example, if the size of the class is large, it is teacher control. And most of the time, whatever happens in the classroom is cognitive domain. And the context is happening in the classroom. And the student type says audio visual. So you can see here, all these 5 are overlapping into a single situation. Or sometimes there could be some places where there could be a single situation also. So depending on whether it is teacher or learner control, the learning method will have to be appropriately selected. For example, lecture could be for teacher control, and library reference could be for learner control. There are many examples for this. We'll come to a very small brief view of those examples a little later. The classification of these learning methods we have done as a kind of in-house activity here. There are 2 variables which are taken. One is the learner autonomy, meaning to say how much independence the learner has, or what is, whether it is learner control or teacher control is one variable. Second is what is the size of the group. Now the learner autonomy could be more or it could be less. The group size could be large or it could be small. Suppose the group size is something like large and the teacher control is more. What you can see is the left down corner. These are the methods which would be more appropriate. Lecture, symposium, team teaching, panel discussion, brainstorming, or symposium. And if the learner size, group size is comparatively small, but the teacher control is still more, then you have something like demonstration or tutorial. On the other side, if the group size becomes smaller, relatively small, if the learner autonomy becomes more, that is learners are more in control of their learning, but the group size is relatively large compared to that. It could be seminar, group discussion, journal club, workshop, project, role play, any of these. And compared to this, if there is a smaller size of the group with the learner autonomy remaining the same, learner autonomy remaining high, you could have something like conference, field work, all those things which are there. Now, when I say conference here, there could be some kind of a misunderstanding to think conference in the terms of national conference or state conference. In fact, those conferences are different activities. Whatever I'm talking here is the conference in the academic context, in the educational context. In the educational context, conference would be something like when the student comes to your department after the lecture to ask some question one-to-one. That becomes confer, to speak one-to-one. That becomes conference. That is a conference in the context of education. So more of this maybe we can discuss when there is a time for larger discussion, but this is a kind of introductory. These are the way how we can classify the various teaching methods. Now, when we go into the online, this is what is the trend now, and it is something which is going to be the future also. When we go into the online digital learning, there's one more tool that we'll have to think of, that is called Colin McNutt Learning Management Model. What it says is, again, there are two variables. One is how much the students are engaged in learning. For example, how much the students are involved in learning. That is one involvement on one plane. The other plane is looking at the activity, the learning activity itself, how much interactivity that learning method affords. Taking these two into consideration, let us take the current situation, whatever I'm presenting now, and you are sitting there, and you are engaged only in making notes, or maybe you are taking the screenshot. This is the only activity which is possible now. And the second is the interactivity of the resource is not very high. It is very low. Like there is no interactivity. You are only seeing and hearing. That is only interactivity. In this, the learning would be, you can say, the volume of learning which is possible. Now, as you increase the engagement of learners, when you give the learners a particular task at the end of this session or at the end of this course, I expect you to perform these activities. The kind of summative task which is given to the student, and the interactivity becomes a little more when the students are able to interact. For example, the students can go out, they can read in the library, they can refer somewhere, they can do some laboratory activity and come back. So this, you can see how much the volume has increased because of the interactivity. And when you give a kind of creative task to the student, you are not limiting the task to telling only this you have to do. Beyond this, these are also the possibilities the student can do, and the interactivity becomes even more. You can see the kind of the phenomenal increase in the volume of learning which happens. And this is what is the tool to be used in digital learning. Digital learning, please note, is not something of shifting my lecture onto the web portal. It is not even sharing my PPT on the web portal. There is something more to it, and that is how do we engage the students, and how do we also create the different learning tools for the students to be interactive with those tools. And when the students are interactive with the creative task, that is what is called as immersive learning which emerges. So this is one background for shifting onto the online. One more thing that has to be remembered is the attention span. On the graph, you can see the attention span is flagging. In fact, more than 1 hour now. So that attention span must be flagging among the participants also. Therefore, I have to keep some kind of a visuals to keep the attention on track. So what happens is, it is estimated about every 20 minutes, the attention span, it flags down. Therefore, every 20 minutes, the teacher has to do something to increase it. and again increase it so that you cover your 60 minutes. Right. So how do we do that? Is by introducing something into the lecture. For example, if I'm taking a lecture, in the lecture, if it becomes monotonous, if my if my voice is something which is going flat, anything which is going flat is flat. Even in the ECG, people will say when the ECG is flat, it is flat. So similarly, anything which goes flat is always flat. Therefore, even the voice modulation is an important factor in holding the attention of learners. This is one of the factors. I'll come to that a little later. And how do you improve the attention? One way is by using the audiovisual aids, because we already have seen 90% of our learners are audiovisual in nature. Therefore, about audiovisuals are very good tools for holding the attention of learners. This is what Edgar Dale told in his book, Audiovisual Methods in Teaching. What he said is, if you are using only, if the students are using only reading, only text, then the attention, their learning would only be 10% at the end of 24 hours. That was a study he conducted. What he said is at the end of 24 hours, how much the student would remember or recall whatever he or she has learned is only 10%, if it is only reading. If it is something like hearing something, like a lecture, it could go up to 20 minutes. Then if it is something like the student sees the image, it could be a still image or a visual image, the learning improves to something like, or the recall improves to something like 30%. And if there is something more, like the student is hearing and seeing something being done, a kind of demonstration, the learning goes up to 50%. And if the student is involved in doing something, a kind of workshop, it goes up to 70%. And when the student does it in a real situation, it becomes 90%. Then how do we make it 100%? Is by doing this over and over again, right? So if you look at the online teaching or online learning, the maximum that we get is up to 50%. Therefore, let there not be a kind of unrealistic a feeling that we can bring about 100% learning only through online learning. Only online learning will not bring about 100% learning. There has to be a human touch, there has to be human presence also for that real learning to happen. One more thing that is very important, one factor is Mehrabian classified the nonverbal communication in the 1970s into 3 components. One, he said the body language of a person is 55% contributing for any learning. So for example, when you look at a teacher, and not only teacher, anybody, if you look at, you form some kind of an opinion about that person. That person has not spoken anything, that person has not done anything. You only have seen that person. Perhaps it is a bias, but that is how things work. 55%. And the teacher, if the teacher is standing in the classroom with a kind of confidence and grace, the students are already 55% learned that. Like they say, I go to the doctor, I feel, doctor ne dekh liya, hum theek ho gaye. So why? That is what is body language. There is a kind of confidence that you get about somebody. So 55% of the communication is with the body language. Another 38% happens with the tone of the voice. The way a person speaks decides how much of it will be accepted, will be taken in. And the remaining 10% is what is the actual words or the knowledge. Therefore, in our teaching, in the face-to-face teaching, whatever my knowledge is only 7% effective. I can be 7% effective if I am using only my knowledge. If I add to the way I speak, my communication, it becomes 38%. And to that, I also add my stature, my confidence, my body language, the way I interact with the students, that will make it 100%. Now, how do we make it this onto the online platform? When you can create an environment for learning. Say, for example, you have 100 students, you are taking class for 100 students or 50 students. If you can create a kind of atmosphere, that becomes 55%. The kind of technology that you use, the technology use and the ease of technology, the awareness of technology becomes 38%. This I'm telling for online from my experience. And 7% is what you teach. Therefore, what we teach directly from the classroom into the online platform, sharing the same PPT, reading out the same PPT the way I was reading it in the classroom, will not bring about any change. It will not be appreciated. Maybe students will keep that video off and go somewhere. Right? It doesn't serve my purpose. So this is what are the background. Now, when we again take into the online factor, you can classify the online teaching into two components. One is synchronous way of teaching, the other is asynchronous. Synchronous is something like I'm streaming now and we are sitting here and listening to that. This is synchronous at the same time. Asynchronous is something like if there is a record of this, somebody wants to see it later, that would become asynchronous. For example, there is something called as learning management system. Some of you would be aware of it. So learning management system is like a software which is there in the university's website, where the students can access some video, some assignments, some PDF, that anytime that they want to see it at the time of their convenience. That becomes asynchronous. So asynchronous is you can pace your learning to suit your timing and convenience. That is asynchronous. Now, synchronous tools would be something like telephone, live chat, streaming video, or web conferencing. These could be the tools which are used for synchronous teaching. Whereas for asynchronous, it could be something like a discussion board, downloadable video, slide presentation, email communication, blog, wiki, tweets, all these either in isolation or together. For example, discussion board, downloadable videos, all these things can be on the same learning management platform. So it becomes a single source. These are asynchronous. Now, using the same tool that I had used earlier to classify the face-to-face learning methods, if I have to use the same tool for classifying the online learning tools, it would look something like this. You have synchronous and asynchronous. Then you have for a group which is a little relatively small. Then for the learner autonomy, when it is more, synchronous, asynchronous. And learner autonomy, it becomes more and the group is small when a single person is doing. This could be the way of classifying the different tools. This is only after of classifying the tools. There could be other ways also. But this is one thing that I have felt more simple to classify. Now, when we shift to online, this is one framework that all teachers will have to remember. There are many frameworks, but this is one which I found quite simple to work with. What it says is there is something like a summer framework, SAMR. Each of the letters stands for one activity. S stands for substitution. What happens in substitution is I am doing the same thing that I was doing in the classroom. Like for example, in the classroom, I was giving lecture using the PPT. Same thing I am doing here. I'm in front of the camera using or sharing the PPT. So I'm substituting. This is the first phase of shifting to the online. And this is how the actual shifting has to happen. From the most simple to then we come to the most complex. So first is substitution. The second is the A, which is the augmentation. Then I augment something once I become familiar, once I become convenient in this, or I become comfortable in this, I can add some more activity called augmenting to it. What I could do is I can use the Google form to take the feedback, or I can use something like a Padlet for online discussion. These are some of the tools which are there and free to use also. So this becomes something like where I am enhancing my learning, my presence, my online presence. So this is the second level. The third level is when I have become a little more confident, what I could do is I could modify the way I teach. Now in both of these, the first thing, substitution, it is totally synchronous. And when you come to augmentation, there could be an element of asynchronicity also. And when you come to modification, there could be a larger asynchronicity where I am not always on the online, and the students can come back and take whatever I want to teach. Say, for example, I can create a content management system. The content management system is a platform where I can host a lot of learning resources. Say, for example, there is something called as Google Classroom. In the Google Classroom, I can host my videos, I can give the assignment, I can schedule some learning activities by using the Google Calendar. So all these things, again, these are all free to use. So I have modified myself from only a streaming lecture to somewhere where I have used augmented, using some tools, one or two tools, to a situation where I have become more confident of using some of the open education resources which are already available on the net to curate them and to host them on my content management system, on my Google Classroom, for example. So this becomes modification. One thing you have to remember about open education resource, most of you would be aware of it, is that open education resources are those which are listed under Creative Commons. Therefore, they are free to use depending on the nature. It could be reusable or reusable with modification, all those things you have to see. But please be sure that these are not something which is under IPR, because you can attract some kind of a copyright violation if you are using something without somebody's knowledge. So always safer to use something which is under Creative Commons. So this becomes modification. And the last phase in this would be redefinition. Redefinition is where I have created my own videos. I create my videos, I create my learning management system, and I transform my entire presence in the online presence, in the online thing. So this is the way the shift has to happen. Graded shift has to happen. I cannot directly jump into learning management system. Maybe some people can do that. They have the flair for it, but not majority of the people can do. For a majority of the teachers, this is how the shift has to happen. And now we come to the last component of assessment. One thing has to be remembered, that students learn what is asked. They do not learn what is taught. And this is where the constructive alignment of BICS also comes into picture. If we are asking what we have taught, or if we are teaching what we are going to ask, there will be alignment. If there is a misalignment, that is where the distrust about the education system sets in. If we have to bring back the trust of students into the education system, then we need to have the kind of alignment, not just alignment, but constructive alignment. For this, let us see what are the purposes of conducting assessment. Why do we conduct assessment? What is the purpose? What is the use? One use of the assessment is to declare pass or fail. This is what everybody knows, and this is a very commonly used reason. The other is, assessments also incentivize learning. When the student knows, when the student sees a feedback that how he or she has learned, it gives a kind of incentive depending on how the teacher has used that feedback to motivate the learning. So it is a kind of motivator for learning. And of course, it gives a feedback to both the teacher and the student on how to improve the teaching or learning. And it also can diagnose where is the problem. For example, when you get a feedback, when we conduct the assessment, as you can reflect from the basic teaching model, the assessment gave feedback to tell whether the teaching was appropriate or not, the entry behavior as assessment was appropriate or not, or whether the assessment method itself was appropriate or not. It diagnoses what is the problem with learning, where the problem lies. And once the problem is understood, you can modify your teaching method if the problem is only in the teaching. Or you can modify anything else wherever is a problem. So these are some of the, you can say, borderline uses. Major use, core use is to declare pass or fail. Then little more into the periphery is these things which are mostly formative in nature. And there are some more which are outside the border, like outliers. One is to redefine the future of the program. So for example, at the end of every program, we need to conduct a program evaluation. That is something which most of us in India do not do. Whereas if you look at any Western university, program evaluation is built into the curriculum design. But we do not do that. It's time that we started doing it. So program evaluation is very important because it tells whether the program was effective or not. And if the program was not effective, why it was not effective, how can we make it effective? The whole purpose is to make it effective for our learners. And another most outlier, perhaps, use would be that it is safety for society. For example, imagine a doctor or an engineer or a pharmacist who has passed without knowing anything about that particular discipline. How safe would that person be to the society? Therefore, assessments or examinations are also one of the factors is safety for society. And how do we conduct a test? What should be the nature of a test? One is the test should be directly related to education objective. Before you test, before you conduct the examination, write the objectives and then frame the question. This is the way it has to be done. We cannot write a question unless you have the objective, because objective is what states what is expected of the student to perform. Then you are going to test whether the student is able to perform that or not. This is where the constructive alignment fits in. The second is the assessment has to be concerned with important and useful matters. Now, how do you decide what is important and what is useful? Further, when we do the curriculum designing, there is something called as a stratification of contents as on the basis of priority. So you create layers of priority to say what is must to know, what is desirable to know, and what is nice to know. So when you have this classification of contents, what is must know, desirable to know, nice to know. The important, useful would be what is must know, and to some extent what is desirable to know. The way we classify is 80% of the assessment will be from must know, 20% will be from desirable to know. We don't ask anything from nice to know. And the third important thing is that the examination has to be which is realistic and practical. When we say, okay, we are conducting examination like this, it should be actually possible to do. Nowadays, there's a lot of hype about online examination, and there's a lot of talk about open book examination. Now, one thing what we have to remember is all these are good, but how realistic it is and how possible it is, how authentic it is. Now, when you say online examination, say specifically for high-stake examination, when the university conducts examination to say pass or fail, how much realistic it would be for a student to write a kind of essay question online. So these are the things which are to be taken as realistic and practical. I'm not saying it is not practical. Are we prepared for it? If we are not, we have to get prepared for it. Then it becomes realistic and practical for us. The flow of assessment would be in this format. First, you have to write what is a quality specific learning objective. Objective is written. Then you identify which is the domain in which it falls into. The domain is written. Then within the domain, there are some levels. This is where we use one more tool called Gilbert tool. I have not introduced Gilbert tool here because of the paucity of time and the nature of the presentation also. There's a tool called Gilbert tool which classifies the specific learning objective in each domain into basic level, intermediate level, and higher level. So whether it is basic, intermediate, or higher, once that is done, what is a medium for assessment for that particular level? Once you identify what is the medium, then what is appropriate tool? I'll show you a little more of this in the next slide. Then once you have the tool, you implement or you execute the assessment. Once you conduct the assessment, you get some data, and that data has interpreted to get a decision. Now the decision could be, this is where the outcome of examination comes. Is the data decision for saying the student pass or fail, or is it to give a feedback to the student where he or she has to improve? The whole process starts here. So this is a kind of a flow chart for conducting assessment. Now coming to the tools of assessment, very basically you have the domain, then you have the level, then you have the medium, and then you have the tools. For this, each of the domain, say for example, you have the cognitive domain. Cognitive domain, you have 3 levels. For each of the 3 levels, appropriately there is a medium. The medium could be something which is a written medium, or it could even be an oral medium. So whatever I'm showing as a medium is how the student is performing. It is not what the teacher is doing, because assessment is what the student does, not what the teacher does. Therefore, what is a medium? Medium could be written medium, or it could be oral medium also. Then depending on that, there could be different tools. Very basically, it could be something like multiple choice question, or it could be short open question, short answer question, or it could be assignment, or it could be viva, or it could be essay, or it could be structured essay question, or it could be assignment, or it could be portfolio. Any of these could be appropriate depending on the domain and the level of the domain. Then for the psychomotor domain, the psychomotor domain assessment is done by performance. The student performing something and the teacher observing. It could be in the form of a checklist, whether the student has done this or not. The same checklist can also be used as rating scale, to what extent. Then there is something called as OSPI or OSCE, especially in the medical field. It is called objective structured clinical examination or objective structured practical examination. This can also be used for other fields. In fact, there is also something called as objective structured teacher examination, to observe how the teachers are performing. Then there is a DOPS, or direct observation of procedural skills. In fact, these procedural skills need not be only for medical faculty, it could be for engineering faculty also, could be architecture also, could be for multimedia designing also. Then there is simulation based assessment. Simulation is when you have a simulator, and the simulator, the student performs something, or a portfolio. A portfolio is something which is common for many of the higher education activities, where the student keeps a tab of activities done over a period of time, and that becomes a kind of file or a portfolio to demonstrate the authenticity of how the performance was done. And coming to the last one, the affective domain, again here the assessment is done on the basis of the learner's performance or on the communication. Here, apart from whatever we have seen in the psychomotor domain, you have an addition of viva voce or oral examination. These are some of the tools which can be used. And I have spoken this in a very in a surface like manner, not getting in the depth of it. In the online assessment, when we talk of online, the most appropriate would be cognitive domain, because psychomotor and affective would be something which require a kind of very higher skill and high technology for the assessments. So cognitive domain, and within cognitive domain, it is uh, realistic to have something like a selected response format, when the options are there for the student to select something like a multiple choice question, true false question, or checklist. And the feature of that is it is easy to grade, and but only recall level questions can be asked. The teacher can only check whether the student is able to recall something or remember something. The teacher cannot check about the decision levels or the understanding level. Difficult to check in the multiple choice question. The other format is something called as constructed response, where the student has to write an answer. It could be something like filling the blanks, or it could be a short answer or an essay answer. Here we can test the higher level learning. It is possible to learn. So these are some of the realistic and practical approaches for online assessment. And one thing that has to be remembered is about the academic dishonesty, which is a huge problem in any of the online learning. But there are ways and means of checking this. Could be something like you run the assignments or the assessment through a plagiarism check before it comes for assessment. The plagiarism itself, the software will check how much of there is similarity, so that whether it has to allow it for further assessment or filter it out to send it back to the student, it is not accepted. Or it could be something like a proctored examination, where the students sit in front of the webcam and the entire performance is in front of the webcam. In fact, I have conducted a pre-test for one of my courses using this technology of proctored webcam, very low tech, only the webcam was used. Maybe there are some software which can capture every movement of the student to make it possible even for high-end, high-stake examinations. It's possible. Academic dishonesty can be taken care of. There are tools. But again, you have to also remember that there are people who can go beyond this, find some loopholes for it. All these are possibilities. Then one thing that about teacher development, career development, is whatever you know about yourself or whatever I know about myself is something like this tip of the iceberg. Unless I have the tools to assess myself, unless I know what are my capabilities, that is where my capability, my potential could be something which is very implicit like this. And how do I know it is when I use a kind of tool? For example, when I use Bloom's taxonomy, I identify my potential to write the objectives. I identify my potential to plan the lesson. If I did not have the tool, I would not know whether it is possible for me to do. So having those tools will bring about your potential more and more, and whatever the water level you can see there will go down and down, so that explicit knowledge becomes more and more. And to do that, there are some propositions taken from National Board for Professional Teachers from US. What it says is teachers are committed to students and learning. This is what the teacher has to have, the kind of approach. The teacher knows the subject they teach and how to teach those subjects to the students. Very important is how to teach to the student, not to anybody else. It is the student. So to the student at that level, that is what is important. Then the teachers are responsible for managing and monitoring student learning. Teacher's responsibility does not end when he or she gives a lecture in the classroom and comes out of it. It is beyond that also. Think systematically about practice and learn from experience. Keep on reflecting on how I can improve. And the teachers have to become members of learning community. This is what Lev and Wenger said, communities of learning. And any professional will create a kind of community. Like for example, you would have a WhatsApp group, you would have a Facebook page where you are sharing your knowledge. So this becomes a community of learning. This is how the teacher can improve. And there are two tools which I would like to introduce very briefly here. One is called as CCAP, which we have developed in Rajiv Gandhi University. It is called Curriculum Implementation and Continuous Assessment Plan. It's a very simple tool. What we do here is we have the whole syllabus, and that whole syllabus we classify into modules. For example, if you have a syllabus for 1 year, one subject to be taught for 1 year, we classify that whole syllabus into 8 modules. Each of the module may be measuring for 1 month, because there could be some disruptions happening in between, and examinations also will have to be conducted within that 12-month duration before giving the result. Therefore, we classify the whole content into 8 modules. Each of the module is written like this, or it is classified further like this. What we do is we say what is the topic or objective, or what are the sub-objectives or subtopics. And for that topic or subtopic, what is the entry behavior? What do we expect the student to be able to know knowledge, skill, or attitude before getting into the class? Then, most important here, we have written learner activity. I have not told what is teacher activity. Teacher activity could be a lecture. In the lecture, what do you expect the student to be performing as an activity? Now, student, very simply put, student is hearing the lecture and making notes. This could be one learner activity. Depending on the level of the objective, we'll have to rate what is a learner activity. If it is only recall level, the student listens to the lecture and makes note is sufficient. If it is to be a kind of decision making, then you have to go a little more. Apart from this, the student goes back into the library, refers and comes back and has a group discussion with a group of students. This will become learner activity. And then learner performance. What is the learner? What do you expect the learner to perform at the end of that learning? That would be the objective that we have written. And for that, what is appropriate assessment tool? Depending on the learner performance, what authentically can check that learner performance will become the assessment tool, and it can be taken from any of the tools that we have already listed. This is a macro level planning of the syllabus. Then we come to the micro level of unit lesson plan. This is how a unit lesson would be planned. There could be many other lesson plans, but we feel this is more simple, where we write some metadata about the students and the class. Then state what is the general objective or the aim. Relevant to the general objective or the aim, what are the specific learning objectives in each of the domain. Then for each of the objective, before that we have a set induction. Set induction is like introducing the topic, which is very important. The way we introduce the topic can create a curiosity to learn, can create a kind of interest to learn. This is very important, because if there is no curiosity or interest, learning would not happen. Therefore, that set induction is also very important. The teacher will have to state what is a set induction and entry behavior assessment that the teacher is going to do. Then you state what is each of the objective. For that objective, what is the medium or the method of teaching or learning. Then how would you assess within the class, and what is the time given for each of the objective. Then conclude. At the end, we also write what are the references used in the APA style. So this is how the micro lesson planning is done. These are some of the 2 tools which the teachers can use for professional development. One is for macro planning, the other is for micro planning. Now, at the end of this session, if you are able to discuss the components of curriculum as being learning objectives, teaching learning methods, media, and assessment, and illustrate the basic teaching model having 4 components, relate the constructive alignment for teaching and assessment, how this is important. Then recall the factors that promote learning outcomes. How do you select the appropriate teaching learning methods depending on the various factors, and match assessment tools to measure the learning outcomes. What are the assessment tools? And if you can plan a professional track by using the tools for improving your teaching quality or teacher quality, I feel this session would be useful and successful. With that, these are the references that I have used. Some of the references which I have written here. So thank you all. If there are any questions, I can take. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. It was an excellent session, sir. Session chair, Professor Vimal Jain, sir, had to leave suddenly. He left just 5 minutes ago, and he has sent me his notes that he has taken down.
Okay.
So now to sum up the program, it has come to my shoulders again.
Okay.
So I'll be ending this session on his behalf. But he has sent me his gratitude to you, and he has sent me the notes that he has taken. So let me please allow me to sum up the session, and then we'll take the question answer session after this. Sir, your session was excellent. You have unfolded a lot of things that we were all postgraduate teachers but not trained teachers. So you have unfolded a lot of things to us, like the WARP theory. You have taught us about the types of learners. You gave us a comprehensive definition of education, and you talked about acquiring knowledge and improving skills and developing attitude, the KSAs. And sir, you also very well told about the curriculum spiral, and taught us the difference between curriculum and syllabus. You discussed Bloom's taxonomy and explained us all how to identify the educational objectives. and your examples were relevant. You all the way went from examples from engineering to veterinary sciences to pharmaceutical sciences. So your examples were relevant and useful for all the participants. Then you also talked about the Collins McNaughty's learning management system. You talked about the SAMR. You also told us about the nature of test, and you gave us guidance how to develop tests and how to put tests to the students, so as to get a proper assessment from the tests. Then you also discussed about the core propositions of teaching. You also exposed to us about the macro and micro planning and the CICAP adopted by the RGUHS. So thank you very much for such an enlightening lightning lesson for us all, teachers who are not trained to be teachers, but we are in the teaching profession. Thank you very much for your lecture, sir. Now I open the session, and if participants have any questions, they can please simply raise their hands, and I'll be glad to unmute them. The first question is coming from Mrs. Dr. Parul Mehta, ma'am. Ma'am, please, you ask the question. I'm unmuting you. Yes, Dr. Parul, ma'am. Parul, ma'am, your voice is not coming through. If you are using a headphone, I request you to please remove the headphone from jack and use the mic.
Is it okay, sir?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, fine.
Sir, my question is that we can measure the learning outcomes that belongs to the psychomotor domains and belongs to the cognitive domains by easily asking the question into theory examination or by taking the practical examination. But how can we measure the learning outcomes that belongs to the affective domains?
Yeah, there are tools for assessing for affective domain. The major tool is one is a checklist, the other is a rating scale. These two would be appropriate. We'll have to design them properly. There's also observation of a person's performance in affective domain. For example, when a student is doing some experiment, how gentle that person is with that experiment, how careful that person is when doing that experiment. This can be listed as a checklist and observe whether the student is doing it or not. This can be tested that way. And if it is communication, then you can have a communication checklist on how the student is speaking, what kind of words he or she is using, what is the language that the teacher, the student is using. Those also can be factored in. In fact, in the context of health science assessments, this is a part of ASCII, which is an examination.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions, please? Please simply raise your hands and I'll unmute you.
पहला और मुझे वही लग रहा है
Dr. Neeraj, sir.
आईटी का पहला तो टाइम.
Okay. Dr. Neeraj, sir, are you willing to ask a question, sir?
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, thank you so much again for enlightening such a beautiful session, sir. Whenever I hear you, I just pray to God, then again I got the opportunity. So thank you very much for this elaborative session. And sir, my question is, sometimes we are having some difficulty while having these online lectures, especially for assessment. So how we can make it rigorous, more rigorous, so that the students can be more attentive?
Well, the online assessments, from experience, if you have to speak, online assessments are for us now relevant in the formative method, like when you want to give feedback to the students, how much they have learned and what more they have to learn. But for high-stake examinations to say they have passed or failed, I still would not prefer to use, because we are not prepared for it. And the way we use online examinations, what I am using, I'll tell you, I am using Google Form for a variety of assessments. And this is something which I find very useful for lower cognitive domain. Like if I want to check whether the student has understood some concept is able to recall the basic knowledge or understanding. And then the multiple choice question, true false question, or checking the box in the Google form would be appropriate. Now, I also have to check my students, because my training is mostly into education methodology, and I train teachers in educational methodology to be trainers. That is what is the major concern that I have in university, and that is what the institute I head. And in this, I also have to check the participants. They're not actually students, they're not teachers whom we train in education methodology. I also have to check whether they're able to correlate the different concepts to form a kind of essay. For that, I'm using something called as reflective writing, and I'm using a blog for that reflective writing. I have created a blog, and on the blog they will have to post the reflective writing by the end of the day. There's one more thing that I had mentioned there, Padlet. I'm also using Padlet for the participants to post their comments, one Padlet per session. So this will be used. That is one more way of using. But one thing that I would like to tell about this Padlet is it is free, but with a restricted use. If you have to have a kind of unlimited use, you'll have to purchase it. For that, the best thing would be to go for a learning management system. And if there is a learning management system, the assessment of students would become much more authentic. What would happen is, I give a lecture, or I provide a video of my lecture, and there is some reading material also which is provided. At the end of that, the student has to answer some questions which are inbuilt into the learning management system. And once the student answers those questions, the student will get the reply or the answer whether it is right or not right. If the answer is right, it will explain why it is right. If the answer is wrong, it will explain it is wrong and direct the student back to the same paragraph or whatever content to read and come back and write. This way there is a back and forth which can happen. That way, online assessment can be really useful if we adapt it. Otherwise, if we are adapting it as a kind of ad hoc arrangement, it becomes frustrating for the teacher also, for the student also, because we can neither find out something whether the student has learned, and the students also have the kind of option where they can look this way or that and they can copy the answers and write. So it has to be something like we have to develop the technology for it.
Thank you, Neeraj sir. Sir, I have a question. This was our first experience after being put into the lockdown. So we started taking online lectures via various platforms. Like I started with first of all Facebook Live, then I went on into Zoom, then I started recording lessons. So I gradually evolved. So the problem is that, sir, when I started using for assessment, I started using Google Forms, like most of my colleagues who are attending the session.
Yes.
The problem was that the students are very smart. They started making their own WhatsApp groups, and they used to combine. I used to put random questions. I used to shuffle the questions. All the available options I used to use, changing the options also. But at the end, I found that most of the students are end up in getting the same answers because they are having access to their WhatsApp group as well as they're accessing the Google for the answering of questions.
Okay.
So, sir, what are your suggestions? How should we do that?
Yeah, even I felt the same problem we had.
Yes,
one thing that I tried is to give a very small window of time for them to submit the answers.
Okay, sir. That we also tried, sir. For that,
okay.
They were very smart, sir. They made small groups on WhatsApp and they started sharing. So our generation, next generation is even smarter than we are, I think.
Okay, then we have to ask them how to crack it.
I just asked if you are using any special tool. Just told about Padlet. So maybe I will try to see what.
The Padlet is actually like a kind of reflective writing. It doesn't test a person. In Padlet, you have to trust a person. The students have to be trustworthy. Only then Padlet would work.
Okay.
Similarly for reflective writing also, because there is it is like an open book assessment where they can refer to many things and then come back.
Sir, are there any special tools that are being developed or currently underway being used by professionals in this respect? I don't know about Western world, but if there are any, could you just share so that we may be able to explore?
No, we still are in a very infancy stage about online all over. Maybe perhaps Manipal Academy might be having something. That is the only place I have heard something is there. Otherwise, I had heard about St. John's Medical College, but I got to know from one of the teachers in a kind of confidentiality that even they are in a very remote and very orthodox system which was there about 20 years old.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you very much, sir. And sir, another question I would like to ask is that in this coming context of this online teaching system, do you find because my students share their feedback कि sir कभी आवाज नहीं आ रहा है, कभी बोलते sir signal down है. I mean, they have got a hell lot of reasons for not attending the class or not being present. Some students are attentive, but they are not getting enough resources to attend. So, are there any ways how we can ensure our delivery is more optimum? You just said that making 100%, 90% तक तो चलो we can ask them to perform, but 100% के लिए तो बार-बार अपन को करना होता है. So, are there any ways how we can improve our online delivery? Because I think this system, this is going to last and going to stay for us.
So one option is to have a learning management system, or at least a content management system, where the students can access whenever they have the access. Like for example, at a particular time when we are giving a lecture, there could be the net which is down.
Yes.
And that time the students are not able to receive the signals. But if it is on the content management, like for example on Google Classroom or even WordPress, if it is there, then whenever the student have the access, they can see that. So best thing is to go for asynchronous, add asynchronous models also into the teaching.
Okay. And
And
sir,
another thing that could be done is to use low bandwidth, if it is possible.
Okay. So what we used to do, we used to record our lectures on Zoom, and then the lectures that are recorded on Zoom are having small size. So we send them through WhatsApp.
Yeah.
That is a good idea, sir. But again, one last question in this regard is, how do you identify the students who are not attending? Because students are a variety. Some students are really very sincere, and some students are really hopeless in this regard. Though I don't label them as hopeless, but I know that they have got their own reasons not to do so.
Attendance, yeah. So one thing can be done is in the attendance, if you are using Google Meet, I do not know about Zoom, but if you are using Google Meet, one of the new tools which has come in is to take the attendance at irregular intervals.
Okay, sir.
That possibility is there. You have to add a plugin from Chrome.
Okay.
You have a Google account. In that Google account, anyway, now Meet is free. And if you are also using Chrome as your browser, you add some plugin for marking the attendance. Right. Another thing is in Google Meet, one of the problem earlier was that you could not see what you are presenting. But now if you are using a double screen, it is called DualS, DualEss, something like. If you add that plugin, you can see the grid view of the students also.
Right. So just to share with you, we had 486 registered participants of this program. Okay. And unfortunately, I had sent the feedback of day one, and 307 teachers participant only gave the feedback. And today, unfortunately, again, this is the tendency that today I could get was only 140 participants.
Okay.
Right now we are getting only 112. So if teachers are like this, I guess students are on the right path, I guess.
Exactly.
That I'm sharing right now with you, sir, on this platform.
Yes.
I thank a lot from the bottom of my heart to you, sir. You had such a nice lecture that you gave to us, and it was really thought-provoking and learning for all of us, sir. And we need to really work upon and gear up for the future coming that is coming for us, sir. Yes. Thank you very much, sir. And with your kind permission, I may please close this session.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you, sir. I have a certificate for you that I would like to share. Okay. So if you just allow me, I'll just take 1 minute more of yours, and we can have this for you, sir. Since we are not connected right now physically, so this is the only way that I could appreciate your efforts for us, sir.
Thank you so much. If I can get a copy through email, it would be.
Yes, sir, I'll be sending it to you through email.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
And if there were some screenshots available of this,
yes, sir, sure.
We can share it on Facebook.
Sure.
The reason I do is it creates a kind of awareness among other people that this is important.
Sir, to tell you more, actually, we were sharing all these lectures live on YouTube, but today, unfortunately, I don't know what has happened. This lecture could not have been streamed, but of course, we have recorded this lecture, and this will be posted on Facebook as well as YouTube channels of the institution.
Okay.
And I'll send you one copy, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, sir. Be safe, sir. Thank you so much for your
Thank you so much. Thank you. Same to you.
Thank you.